End quote. You have 24 hours to tear down that pile of sticks, or I'll have a sheriff here to personally oversee your eviction. End quote. She screamed at me, her face a shade of crimson that didn't and oppose. T quite match her designer scarf, and as I stood there on my own dirt, smelling the fresh-cut cedar and the mountain air, I realized this woman didn't and oppose. T just want me gone. She wanted to erase me from the map. My name is Elias Thorne, and a few months ago, I was just a tired master carpenter from Chicago who had reached his breaking point, looking for a way to start over after a divorce that stripped me of everything but my tools and my pride, and that in oppose. That's when I inherited the Indapos, Eagle's Nest in Oppos, 40 acres of rugged, breathtaking Colorado wilderness from my great-uncle Silas, a man everyone called a hermit, but who, as it turns out, was more of a silent king. I remember pulling up to the property for the first time in my rusted F-150, the suspension groaning under the weight of my life in Oppos. S remains and looking out over the valley where the mist clung to the pines like a damp blanket, thinking that finally, for once in my 42 years, I was free of the noise, the neighbors, and the red tape of the city. But man, was I wrong. By the third morning, while I was framing the subfloor of what I hoped would be a modest cabin for me and my daughter Clara to spend her summers, a white Range Rover came barreling up the access road like it was chasing a fugitive, and outstepped Margaret and Oppos, Peggy and Oppos, Sterling, the self-appointed queen bee of the Crestwood Homeowners Association. She didn't in Oppos lead with a hello or a welcome to the neighborhood. She led with a clipboard and a sneer, her perfume so thick it actually made my eyes water as she marched across my workspace in shoes that cost more than my first truck, telling me that my and Oppos, structure and Oppos, violated 7 different covenants of the Crestwood HOA, from the pitch of the roof to the exact shade of the wood stain I had and Oppos. T even picked out yet. I just leaned on my hammer, trying to keep my voice steady, and told her that according to my deed, I wasn't Oppos. T part of any association, that this land had been in my family since before the valley had electricity, but Peggy just smiled, that cold, practiced smile of someone who spends their weekends reading legal loopholes for fun, and told me that in Oppos. Times change, Mr. Thorne, and standards must be maintained for the sake of our property values. And Oppos. She handed me a cease and desist order that looked like it had been drafted by a shark, claiming I owed 6 months of backdated in Oppos, community assessments in Oppos, totaling nearly $4,000. And as I watched her drive away, I felt that familiar weight in my chest, that feeling that no matter how far you run, someone is always waiting there with a bill and a badge. But what Peggy didn't in Oppos, Tino, what she couldn't in Oppos, T have possibly guessed, was that Uncle Silas wasn't Oppos. T just a cranky old man who liked solitude. He was a man who understood the long game, a man who had spent 40 years watching the world move in on him and decided to build a fortress out of paperwork instead of stone. Over the next week, the harassment turned into a full-blown siege, with the HOA sending and Oppos, compliance officers and Oppos, to my gate at 6 in the morning to photograph my trash cans and anonymous complaints being filed with the county about and Oppos, environmental runoff and Oppos, from my tiny, hand-dug well, and even my daughter Clara started getting messages from local kids she had in Oppos. T even met yet, telling her that her dad was A and Oppos, land pirate and Oppos, who was ruining their parents in Oppos. Investment. It got to the point where I couldn't in Oppos to even pick up a saw without a drone hovering over my head, and I realized that Peggy wasn't Oppos. T just enforcing rules. She was trying to break my spirit, so I'd sell the land to the developer she was clearly in bed with, a massive luxury resort group called in Oppos, Apex Peaks in Oppos, that needed my 40 acres to complete their private golf course. I was sitting in Silas's old workshop one night, the rain drumming on the tin roof, and my head in my hands, when I kicked a loose floorboard near the workbench, and underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a waterproof pelican case, I found the Oppos, Black Ledger and Oppos, a collection of deeds, maps, and corporate filings that made my jaw hit the floor. You see, Silas didn't and Oppos. T just owned the Eagle's Nest. Back in the late 90s, when the original Crestwood development went belly up during the first big crash, Silas had used his life savings to quietly buy the underlying and Oppos, ground leases and Oppos, for the entire valley, meaning that while the people in those million-dollar mansions thought they owned their homes, they were actually just leasing the dirt beneath them from a shell company called and Oppos, Silver Fox Holdings and Oppos, which Silas had, left entirely to me. But it got better or worse depending on whose side you were on, because as I dug through the filings, I realized that the Crestwood HOA had never actually been legally chartered on my land. In fact, Peggy's own house, the headquarters of her little empire, sat directly on a parcel where the ground lease had expired 3 months ago because she had been sending the payments to a defunct P.O. box instead of the actual owner. I spent the next 48 hours with a high-priced real estate attorney in Denver who looked at my documents like they were the Holy Grail, and he told me, and Oppos, Elias, you don and Oppos, T just have a defense. You have the power to turn that entire neighborhood into a parking lot if you felt like it, and Oppos. And Oppos. That's when the plan started to form. Not a plan for revenge, but a plan for a very, very loud awakening. I waited until the annual and Oppos, State of the Valley and Oppos, meeting, which Peggy held in the community clubhouse, a place dripping with crystal chandeliers and the kind of ego that only comes from people who think they're better than a mountain they live on. And I walked in there wearing my grease-stained work pants and a flannel shirt, carrying a manila folder that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Peggy was at the podium, mid-sentence about how and Oppos, unauthorized residents are a blight on our communal harmony, and Oppos, when I walked right up to the front, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the catering bins. She looked at me with this look of pure, unadulterated disgust and said, and Oppos, Mr. Thorne, this is a private meeting for homeowners only. Please escort yourself out before I call security, and Oppos. And I just smiled, pulled out the certified deed to the land the clubhouse was sitting on, and said, and Oppos, actually, Peggy, since the ground lease on this building expires at midnight, and I'm the new landlord, I think I'll stay. But you might want to start packing, because your rent just went up to $50,000 a month, effective 5 minutes ago, and Oppos. The chaos that followed was like something out of a movie. People screaming, Peggy turning a shade of white that matched the walls, and her lawyer frantically whispering in her ear while I laid out the truth for everyone to see. That the HOA had been collecting fees for and Oppos, amenities and Oppos, that they didn't and Oppos to even own the land for, and that Peggy had been embezzling from the community fund to pay off the property taxes on her own over-leveraged estate. I showed them the maps, I showed them the contracts, and I showed them the letter from Apex Peaks offering Peggy a $2 million in Oppos, consulting fee in Oppos, if she could successfully harass me into selling my land. And by the time I was done, the neighbors who had been sending me hate mail were looking at Peggy like she was a venomous snake in a silk dress. I could have evicted them all. I could have sold the whole valley to the developers and walked away with enough money to never swing a hammer again. But as I looked at the faces in that room, families who had put their life savings into those homes, people who had been lied to and manipulated just like I had, I realized that wasn't Oppos. T what Silas would have wanted, and it wasn't Oppos. T the kind of man I wanted my daughter to see when she looked at me. So I made them an offer. I would dissolve the HOA immediately. I would sign over the ground rights to every individual homeowner at the original 1990s cost, so they could finally, truly own their land. But in exchange, Peggy Sterling had to vacate the valley by sunset, and the remaining and Oppos, community fund and Oppos, would be donated to the local Forest Conservancy to make sure Apex Peaks never touched a single tree on those mountains. Peggy tried to fight it. She tried to scream about and Oppos, contractual obligations and Oppos, and Oppos, due process and Oppos. But when the sheriff, the same one she had threatened me with, arrived and saw the evidence of her financial fraud, he didn't end Oppos. T asked me to leave. He asked her to put her hands behind her back. Watching her get led out of that clubhouse in handcuffs, her designer heels clicking on the floor for the last time while her Range Rover sat in the parking lot waiting to be repossessed, was the most satisfying thing I've ever experienced. But it wasn't in Oppos. T Abu. T the win. It was about the peace that settled over the valley afterward. Now, when I'm up on the Eagle's Nest, finishing the roof on my cabin with Clara handing me the shingles, I don an Oppos. T hear drones and I don an Oppos. T see clipboards. I can see neighbors who actually stop by to help, who bring over extra garden vegetables instead of fines, and who finally understand that a community ISN and oppos, T-build on covenants and oppos, standards and oppos, but on the dirt we all share and the respect we give to the people standing on it. But it makes me wonder, every time I look down at those big houses in the valley, how many other people are living in a house of cards they don and oppos, to even know they and oppos, repaying for? Is the person running your neighborhood really looking out for your and oppos, property values and oppos, or are they just looking for a way to value your property for themselves? I'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever had an HOA that went off the rails, or a neighbor who thought they owned the air you breathe? Drop a comment below, because the more we talk about these little kingdoms, the harder it is for people like Peggy to keep the crown.